Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome to this radio program Omer Bartov, who is a Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. He is a historian of the Holocaust and is considered one of the world's leading authorities on the issue of genocide itself. He joins us for a conversation about his book. It's called Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis. Omer Bartov, thank you very much for taking time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think a lot of us have been thinking about the word genocide in recent months. It has its roots as a legal term from 1948 that came out of the UN Convention on Genocide. Basically, this isn't exact words, but basically says an attempt to wipe out in whole or in part a people. And so it is a legal term, but it's also, but language isn't always that neat, right? It's also a term we use to describe the most horrendous thing possible we can. It's one of the most powerful words we have in language to express just utter horror over what's happening. How do you see the use of the term genocide?
So yes, first of all, genocide is a legal term, and the crime of genocide is a crime under international law, and it's a term that was coined with that intent in mind. It was coined by Raphael Lemkin already in 1943, published a book about it in 1944, and in 1948 it became a UN resolution. And when I talk about it and write about it, I insist on using that definition because under international law, that's the only definition that matters. So that's one side of it. It has been criticized by many people precisely for the reason that you gave. That is, that the term genocide came to be not simply a crime under international law, but also something that describes the crime of crimes, the worst crime that can be undertaken by anyone. And therefore, when you see something terrible happening, if you don't call it genocide, then you are seen as trying to diminish the extent of that. If you call it a war crime, a crime against humanity, it somehow feels like, well, but is it genocide? You are diminishing the gravity of this crime, and that becomes a problem in the sense that you're using that term for anything that you find objectionable, either because of its extent, that is the number of people who are dying, or because of its intent. That is, why are you doing that? Now, we have to understand that in the definition of genocide, by the Genocide Convention, genocide is the intent to destroy a group, a particular group, in whole or in part. And so what you have to show when you are observing genocide, and if you want to see whether it is a crime under international law, you have to show an intent, that is, expressions of intent by people in executive with executive authority, an intent to destroy a particular group as such, that is, to kill people, not as individuals, but as members of a group. And secondly, you have to show that this intent is being implemented in whole or in part. And that's difficult to do because often people engaged in genocide do not broadcast their intent to do so. And often you will find whether this was genocide or not only subsequent to the event itself. But if you don't do that, if you are unable to show that, and as you know now, the International Court of Justice is trying to determine that, it is easier to show that a particular military organization or state is engaged in war crimes or in crimes against humanity. And those do not necessitate showing intent. What you have to show is actions on the ground. Um, and so in some ways, when you get into the debate on genocide, you're actually moving away from saying, well, but what we are seeing now are crimes and that has to be dealt with. You're saying, well, let's wait and see if it's genocide or not. So in some ways, it can be used either as a propaganda tool to say, well, this is genocide and therefore it's completely objectionable, or as a way to postpone judgment on something that you are seeing actually going on the ground, which is unlawful killing of large numbers of civilians.
Omer Bartov, you write and you have written a lot about I think you call a process of brutalization that the Israeli Defense Forces over the years has conducted in Palestine. Can you talk to me about this process of brutalization and how you feel about whether or not genocide is occurring in Gaza?
Yes, so look, I mean, all wars include a process of brutalization of soldiers. You send young men and women to fight, and fighting brutalizes people. That's we just have to know that. And I wrote, years ago, the brutalization of the German army in World War II on the Eastern Front. And in fact, in 1987, I wrote a letter to the defense minister of Israel at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, who later became prime minister and later was a signatory of the Oslo Accords and was then assassinated for having tried to bring peace. I wrote him at the time that I had just come back from writing a PhD on the brutalization of the German military. And under his leadership, there are signs that the Israeli army, which I had been a soldier in 73, was also undergoing a process of brutalization in trying to quell the first Palestinian Intifada. He then issued orders to break their bones. And so, first of all, war brutalizes. But what brutalizes even more is occupation. And occupation not only brutalizes, it also corrupts. It corrupts the occupier, and it corrupts the occupier not only in the sense that people who are involved in oppressing others become corrupted by this practice of oppression over time, but it corrupts actually the entire political system engaged in that. And we have seen that process over decades, since 1967, an increasing corruption of the entire Israeli political system, whose bitter fruits we are observing right now.
What is that
Uh,
corruption? How do you where do you see that corruption?
so the most important thing on in this discussion would be that if you send young men and women who are serving their nation as soldiers, and in Israel there is universal conscription. If you send them to spend most of their service policing another population, breaking into homes at 4 in the morning, messing up people's homes, waking up their babies, beating people up, keeping them handcuffed for hours and hours, and then you send them back home, these young people. What this creates is a sense of superiority over another population, is a sense that we have a right to act in a particular way toward other people. So you're not only brutalized in the sense that you get used to implementing violence against people, you are also then you bring that home, and you internalize a certain sense of superiority over another group, right? You also get used to the idea, and we have to understand that in the country between the Jordan and the sea, mandatory Palestine, there's 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews. It's 50-50. But the 50% of Palestinians, 2 million of them are Israeli citizens, who in many ways are second-class citizens, but at least enjoy some rights of citizenship and the law and so forth. 3 million are in the West Bank. They have no rights. They live under a completely different legal system, which is a military system. So you get used to this idea, and then you have over 2 million people living in Gaza, who have been living under siege now for 17 years. And so you get used to the idea that other people are not as human as you are. That is, it's a dehumanizing perception of half of the population in the country in which you live. That corrupts the entire moral fabric of a country over time. And the idea, and I've experienced it many a time, you can go to a restaurant or to a bar in Tel Aviv, and you are in a nice Western city. You get into your car and you drive 20 miles to the east, and you're in a completely different universe where there are people who have absolutely no control over their lives, and there's soldiers and police who can do with them whatever they like. They can arrest them on administrative arrest and keep them in jail for as long as they like without even showing them what they're accused of. It's a completely Orwellian situation that has not been reported and has been completely accepted by the Israeli population and much of the world until October 7th. So that is a deeply, deeply corrupting process that has sort of spread in Israel. In many ways, the numerous Netanyahu administrations have perpetuated that, have excused it, have sort of packaged it nicely. Israel as being the high-tech nation, startup nation, and this whole shoving the issue under the rug exploded in everybody's face on October 7th.
When you wrote to Yitzhak Rabin about this process of brutalization that you studied, and you were a specialist on the German military, World War II, and saw parallels, if that's not the correct term, you'll correct me, but parallels with what the IDF was doing, he responded to you.
He did. So, and I did not expect him to respond because I wrote him on a postcard that was really about a particular event of the killing of a Palestinian boy, and I was quite outraged. So I hand wrote in very small letters on the postcard. And 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the Minister of Defense, and it had one line in it. And it said, "How dare you compare the German Wehrmacht to the Israeli Defense Forces?" And then I wrote him a second letter explaining exactly what I had in mind. And I'm not saying, not even now, that the IDF is doing similar things to what the Wehrmacht carried out on the Eastern Front in World War II, and certainly not at the time. And I got a second response from him, which said exactly the same thing. How dare you compare? Which is a kind of cliche in Israel. How dare you compare? So you can't compare because the main comparison is you cannot compare the Holocaust, that is our case of total victimhood, to anything else, let alone to actions that we are doing. So that's the kind of logic behind it, right? But I think his response to me was interesting, not because of what he said, but because he responded. And I don't think that he was only responding to me, of course, but between 1987 and the early 1990s, something happened to Rabin. And Rabin understood, as a military man, and not a particularly empathetic fellow, he understood that this occupation and this position that Israel is in will only undermine it. That in the long run, both he was thinking also about rocket warfare, but he was thinking also about the occupation. It's costing too much money, it's costing too much effort, and it's costing a very high price, moral price. And I think he understood that this will corrupt Israeli society and weaken its defenses. And that's why he moved along reluctantly, but ultimately embraced the idea of partitioning that country and allowing the existence of a Palestinian state next to the state of Israel. But of course, not least due to vicious incitement by Netanyahu, he was assassinated. And Netanyahu is the great profiteer of that assassination. And his whole career has been built on that, on killing that prospect. And if you want to see the two faces of this process, one was a general, he was already a brigade commander when he was 26 in the War of 1948, Rabin, and Netanyahu, whose whole career has been dedicated to somehow doing away with this Palestinian issue altogether and making the country a sort of empire between the Jordan and the sea with Jewish supremacy.
You're not saying that Netanyahu was at all involved in the assassination of Rabin, but that the impetus that would have caused the assassination comes from the same desires or politics that Netanyahu has?
Look, I mean, I think that Netanyahu, as a politician, as a charismatic politician at the time, was consciously inciting against Rabin. It's not that he had in mind that Rabin would be assassinated, but there were warnings about it. Rabin was being shown in posters as wearing an SS uniform, to evoke again all these kind of internalized fears in the Israeli population of the Nazis coming back. And I'd say incitement, to go back to the issue of genocide, incitement to genocide is a crime. There were people charged with genocide, with the Rwandan genocide, for incitement, not for carrying it out, but for inciting for genocide on the radio in Rwanda. This kind of incitement, which is going on right now in Israel too, against anyone who is opposed to the policies of this government, leads to violence, and all politicians know it. And Netanyahu, who is a very savvy politician and a very intelligent man, wanted to completely undermine Rabin, despite warnings that were being issued at the time that if you use this kind of imagery, right, there were rabbis at the time who were saying that he was, they use a religious term, but what they meant was that his blood, you were allowed, in fact, you were ordered to spill his blood. He was an enemy of the people. This man who was a hero of 1948, not for Palestinians, mind you, but at least for the Jewish War of Independence. And so, yes, I think that Netanyahu had Rabin's blood on his hands, and I think that now he has the blood of far more people on his hands because of the incredibly incompetent way in which he's been leading the country, and because of the deeper underlying reasons that brought this terrible crisis to even occur.
Omer, Bartov, you've also been criticized or maybe even accused of comparing the Holocaust to the Nakba, the catastrophe for Palestinians in 1948. But my understanding is you're not comparing them, but you're talking about their connection, that the Nakba is now linked to the story of the Holocaust.
Yeah, I don't know who accused me of comparing the Holocaust to the Nakba. I haven't.
I think I heard
that.
Benny Morris. I heard Benny Morris say that.
Was he saying that? That's well. I know Benny Morris well. We're friends, but Benny has a tendency sometimes to sort of go overboard. Without Benny Morris, who has made an incredible contribution to the story of the Nakba, we would not have known half of what we know about what happened in 1948, the expulsion of the Palestinians. He wrote a huge book based on Israeli political and military documents to show the expulsion of the Palestinians. So I have a lot of admiration for his work as a historian. Politically, he's been known to say less responsible things than his very, very meticulous scholarship would seem to suggest. I have never compared the Holocaust to the Nakba. These are two completely different events, completely distinctive from each other. What I have written about, and what I think is really crucial to understand, is that they have become inextricably entangled with each other. And the reasons for why that happened, and I'm hardly the first one to have said that, I can't take credit for it, but I have also written about it. The reason is that the Holocaust ended in 1945. The Nakba occurred in 1948. Many of the people who participated in the War of 1948 as soldiers, about a third of the people who participated in the War of 1948 as soldiers, and soldiers often took part in expulsions of Palestinian villages, towns, and so forth, were people who came from the Holocaust. But beyond that, for the Israeli public at the time, the Holocaust was something that had just occurred. It was an attempt to destroy the entire Jewish people. And for most people living in Palestine at the time, whether they came directly from the Holocaust or they came in the 1930s, they all had families there. Their families were destroyed. They believed, and one might say they had good reason to believe, that the only reasonable outcome from the Holocaust was to create a Jewish state. It made complete sense to create one place where the Jews would have a home, where they could defend themselves, where they would not have to rely on other nations, other governments to protect them, because they didn't during the Holocaust. In order to do that, everything was allowed. And as they were trying to create their state, the people who were living in Palestine, two-thirds of the population were Palestinian Arabs. And the Palestinians understood by then that they would be losing all or large parts of their own country. And they resisted it. And so what you had at that point was a struggle between one group that felt that it had to have a place of its own, a place where Jews would be a majority. And it made sense to want that. And another group that said, this is our home. We didn't carry out the genocide of the Jews. It was the Germans and other Europeans who did it. And you want to kick us out of our homes so that you have security. And in that sense, these two really traumatic events, which are not comparable. I mean, what the Nakba can be described as ethnic cleansing. There was no intention to destroy the Palestinian people as such. There was an intention to move them out, to push them out, to expel them, or to terrify them into fleeing from what became the state of Israel. But it was brutal. It was inhumane. The Holocaust was the largest scale genocide of the 20th century and continent-wide. And so these are two distinct events, but the people engaged in it are connected to each other, and the logics of the repercussions of one event and the implementation of another are very closely linked. And the link is not only what happens in 1948, the link is all the way to the present, all the way to the present. The Nakba, of course, is an ongoing event because the Palestinians have never been able to come back. Large numbers of them are still refugees. What is happening now in Gaza is, as many people would say, a second Nakba. It is still happening. And the Holocaust, although as an event it ended, it remained deeply ingrained in how Israelis understand themselves, partly because of family memories, collective memories, and partly because the Israeli state, certainly since the 1980s, has made the Holocaust into an instrument of politics and has used it to persuade Israeli citizens that they must justify the kind of actions that it has taken against occupied Palestinians. And so these two events are still very closely linked. And we have to understand that to have this entanglement in order to actually reach some kind of, I would say, reconciliation between the two groups, they have to accept this entanglement and the tragedy one of the other.
I certainly have no desire to cause any conflict between you and Benny Morris. It's possible I misinterpreted what I heard him say, though I thought I did hear him say that in a book talk with you online. Um, but Benny Morris's book is important about 1948, and in his investigation, he finds that Jewish soldiers in Palestine who were held in concentration camps disproportionately committed war crimes in 1948, 1947 in Palestine. And I guess to me, that's not so surprising. I see these memes online all the time, and they say the irony between one people who, had the Holocaust and then now what they're doing in Gaza. And I guess I don't see the irony in it at all. I would almost accept, or not accept, but expect people who were traumatized to inflict a trauma on another people.
So, Benny Morris has a book coming out that I haven't read yet on crimes committed in 1948, both by Israeli troops and I believe by Palestinians. And there were crimes committed by both groups, of course. But I haven't read it, so I can't say entirely. I can't comment on that. I can say that clearly crimes were committed both by Israeli troops who were Palestinian, that is, who were born in a mandatory Palestine or came as young men and women, and those who came after the Holocaust. There was a tendency, and I heard that from some veterans of that war. My parents were soldiers in that war. A tendency to say it was the people who came from the Holocaust who behaved in ways that we would not have behaved. They were brutalized by what they had experienced. Whether that was true or not is another question, I would say, because there was just a tendency to think about them by those who grew up in Israel as brutalized. It was not a particularly pleasant thing to hear because it also meant that we were sort of superior to those people who had lived under the Nazis. But, maybe there is some statistics that can show one thing or another. The second thing that you indicated, and I think that's very important, we have a tendency to think that people who underwent horrors, who were victims of violence, would be more humane. There is this argument, how could the Jews who have undergone the Holocaust exercise such violence against Palestinians? There's another argument that says, isn't it ironic, as you say, that the Jews who had experienced the Nazis do the same thing to the Arabs? This is pedagogically and psychologically bizarre and often politically useful. You cannot expect that people who underwent horror would be humanized by it. They may be brutalized by it, they may not be. But the idea that having undergone genocide, you would say never again genocide, is something that was sort of raised after 1945, but meant very different things to different people. If it meant never again genocide in the sense of never again the Holocaust, then the Holocaust was over by the time these slogans were put up. If it meant never again genocide of the Jews, then that's what the Israeli state took up as its mantle. And as such, it has given license to the Israeli state to exercise violence against others. And if it meant never again genocide to anyone, then obviously that never worked. There were many genocides after 1945. So the idea that you can, as I've heard people say, and often in the United States, that if we teach about genocide, we can teach tolerance and love of your fellow man, why would you think that teaching atrocity makes people more humane? It may have the exact opposite effect. So I'd say you have to know that. You have to know those horrors that happened in the past. You have to learn something from them, but you cannot expect to draw these lessons automatically from them. You have to actually teach people not only about the horrors of the past, but also how they behave with their neighbors right now, how they actually interact on a social and political level with the current neighbors, rather than say, my neighbors now resemble those who persecuted me decades earlier. That is the kind of prism through which, if you see reality through that prism, then you will never see it for what it is. You will only see it through your own sort of tortured imagination.
Is there a difference between the words Holocaust and genocide? We say the Holocaust to refer to what happened to the Jewish people in Europe in the 1940s. But of course, we also say nuclear holocaust is another way we use the term. The word Holocaust itself is sort of a compound Greek term, meaning something like something wholly burnt, something that was sacrificed and then burnt by fire afterwards. Is there a significant difference between these two terms, Holocaust and genocide?
So that's two questions really. One is the name itself. And the name itself, a lot of people don't really like it, and for good reasons, Holocaust, because it does refer to burnt offering in Greek. And so what it seems to imply is some sort of sacrificial act, some act with some kind of religious implication. And the Holocaust was not that. The Holocaust was a concerted effort by one particular state and many collaborators to destroy a particular group as such. That's what it was. Some of them were burned, some of them were gassed, some of them were shot. But this was I'd say the epitome of how we understand genocide. So that's one question. In Israel, it's not called the Holocaust, it's called Shoah. And Shoah means disaster, catastrophe. In fact, it's very close to the Palestinian word Nakba.
Mm.
They mean more or less the same thing, a disaster. And you can say in Israel an aerial disaster or a natural disaster using the same word as the word that you use for the Holocaust in Hebrew, for Shoah. You just say HaShoah, the Shoah. So that's what makes it different from other Shoot, from other Holocausts. In France, they dislike this term, and they usually call it, now they use the term Shoah. They've adopted the Hebrew term. In the past, it was called Genocide. This is how people spoke about the Holocaust. And the Nazis obviously never used it. They talked about Judenvernichtung. This was the most, the best definition of what they were doing, extermination of the Jews. This is what it was. So the terminology has all kinds of implications, and there are reasons why it is used. Often people don't even think about them, but there are reasons for it. Now, as for the relationship between the Holocaust as the genocide of the Jews and other genocides, there has been for a long time, certainly in Israel, an attempt to speak of the genocide as unique, and certainly as unique from other genocides. And I think that has major implications, political implications, but it generally makes no sense. Because first of all, the term genocide, coined by Lemkin, as we said, and then becoming part of international law shortly after the Holocaust, is really crafted with the Holocaust in the background. This is happening right during and immediately after the Holocaust. And so when people think about genocide and how you define genocide, the largest such event that they can think about is what just happened to the Jews and obviously also to many other people under Nazi rule. But secondly, to think of a historical event as unique for a historian makes no sense. Because on the one hand, all historical events are unique, of course. History doesn't repeat itself, right? So the French Revolution is unique. The Russian Revolution is unique. It didn't happen. It cannot happen again. It happens only one time. But on the other hand, if you want to understand any historical event, you must understand it within its own context. Otherwise, it's metaphysics, it's not history. What are the roots of it? What are events that are similar to it? And so, if you take the Holocaust specifically, you can say there are unique aspects to the genocide of the Jews. Extermination camps, like those created by the Nazis, did not exist before, and thank God have not existed after. But communal killings, as those that I wrote about in a book, that happen in numerous towns all over Eastern Europe, happen also in Bosnia, happen in Rwanda, happen in many other genocides. So like all genocides, the Holocaust has unique aspects and has many aspects that it has in common with other cases of genocide and other types of mass killings. And we have to understand them if we want to understand what it was, and we don't want to keep it at that kind of metaphysical level that the term Holocaust actually alludes to.
How did what happened in World War II become known as the Holocaust?
So the term Holocaust starts being used really only in the 1960s and becomes more and more common currency in the 1980s. It was not used before. People talked about the mass murder of the Jews. Jews themselves talked about Churban or Churban, destruction, calamity, Puranut, which is another word for destruction. But the term Holocaust sort of filters into general discourse only in the 1980s. Sort of starts late 60s and then more and more. The first most important book on the Holocaust by Raoul Hilberg, which comes out in 1961, is not called the Holocaust. It's called The Destruction of European Jewry. So he uses the term destruction, which is equivalent more or less to Vernichtung, to the German term, extermination, annihilation, or destruction. So it takes a long time for that term to come in. Interestingly, one important moment is in 1978, 79, with the NBC miniseries, The Holocaust, which then makes that term much more popular in America. And then when it's shown in Germany, then the term starts being used in Germany too. And the Germans now often use the term Holocaust, and they usually spell it in the English spelling and not the German spelling with a C and not a K, to imply that this is a term that comes from America, although originally it's actually spelled with a K because it comes from Greek.
Omer Bartov has been our guest. Again, Omer Bartov is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University. He is the author of many books, including his latest called Genocide, the Holocaust, and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis. Omer Bartov, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.